The emperor has just risen from his gilded couch, and the room falls into a silence so complete you can hear the oil lamps hissing. He's smiling, not the smile of a host pleased with his gathering, but something else entirely. He begins walking slowly behind the senators, one by one. He extends his hand toward a woman whose husband sits 3 feet away, paralyzed. She looks at her husband, silently begging. And in that moment, you understand what absolute power actually means. Before we descend into this darkness together, I'd genuinely love to know, where in the world are you watching from? It's still remarkable to me that a story from ancient Rome can spark curiosity from Tokyo to Toronto, from Sao Paulo to Stockholm. Drop your city in the comments. 39 AD, the man commanding this violation is Gaius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. History knows him as Caligula. He's been emperor for barely 2 years. He's 27 years old. And what you're witnessing isn't an isolated incident of imperial excess. It's Tuesday, and over the next few minutes, you're going to discover 7 acts so transgressive that they shocked even Romans. A civilization not exactly known for prudishness. Much of what we're about to explore comes from multiple independent sources, written by historians who hated each other, who served different emperors, who had every reason to contradict one another. Yet their accounts align in the most uncomfortable ways. Some details were likely exaggerated. That's documented too consistently to dismiss. The woman Caligula chose that night was named Livia Orestilla. Her husband, Gaius Calpurnius Piso, was a consul, one of the highest-ranking officials in Rome. Caligula took her hand, left the banquet with her, and returned an hour later alone. 3 days later, Caligula divorced his current wife and married Livia Orestilla in an official imperial ceremony. She was Empress of Rome for exactly 15 days before he divorced her to and sent her into exile. Why? Because power without limits doesn't need reasons, it only needs opportunity. But that violation, horrific as it was, barely scratches the surface of what Caligula would do with the absolute authority Rome had granted him. Let's start with something that made even his contemporaries deeply uncomfortable. His relationship with his sister Drusilla. Caligula had 3 sisters, Agrippina, Drusilla, and Livilla, and according to Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and Tacitus, he maintained inappropriate intimate relationships with all of them. But Drusilla was different. The relationship apparently began when they were adolescents, possibly around 23 AD, when Caligula was 11 years old. It continued openly until her death in 38 AD. This wasn't whispered scandal confined to private chambers. The court knew. Senators muttered about it in corridors. Foreign dignitaries reported it in their dispatches home. When Drusilla died, probably from fever, possibly from complications of pregnancy, Caligula's reaction crossed from grief into something unrecognizable. He declared mandatory national mourning and made it a criminal offense to laugh, bathe, or dine with family during the mourning period. Then he went further, assigned priests, demanded worship, and, according to multiple sources, refused to allow her burial for days. He sat beside her corpse, spoke to it as if she could still hear him, caressed it as attendants stood by in horror, unsure whether to intervene or pretend they noticed nothing. This was about demonstrating that the emperor existed beyond human law, beyond moral boundaries, beyond even the natural order of life and death. If he said his dead sister was divine, then she was divine. If he said mourning required national participation, then an entire empire mourned. Now, You might think that surely Caligula's wives would have been treated with more dignity, with some semblance of respect. You'd be wrong. His final wife, Caesonia, married him in 39 AD when she was already over 30, considered quite old by Roman standards, and had been married 3 times before. She wasn't from a particularly prestigious family, yet Caligula became obsessed with her. With Suetonius records that Caligula believed Caesonia had given him a love potion that drove him mad, and significantly. Caligula seemed pleased by this idea, as if madness excused or even justified his behavior. But the obsession manifested in disturbing ways. He frequently exhibited her in humiliating circumstances before friends, military officers, and members of the Praetorian Guard. He would display her as one might display a prized possession, not to humiliate her specifically, but as a form of pride, as a hunter might show off a trophy. Whether Caesonia consented or simply had no choice is a question that collapses under scrutiny. Because what does consent mean when the person asking has absolute power over your life and death? Caesonia bore him a daughter, Julia Drusilla. In 39 AD, Caligula adored the child, but in a profoundly unhealthy way. According to contemporary accounts, he would test the infant's temperament through deliberately cruel methods, scratching her face to see if she would cry or remain stoic, claiming he was determining whether she possessed the proper imperial nature to tolerate adversity without complaint. He made disturbing comments about how he would know she was truly his daughter because she showed signs of aggression even in infancy, as if violence in a baby was something to celebrate. This wasn't fatherly affection. This was ownership, projection, and something much darker. Then there were the games of Jupiter. Caligula didn't just believe he was divinely appointed, he believed he was literally divine. After several months of rule, he began dressing as various gods, Jupiter, Mars, Apollo. He constructed a temple to himself, complete with priests, sacrifices, and a life-sized golden statue. But he took it a step further. He began claiming that he was fulfilling divine will through acts involving the wives of senators. Women would be summoned to his temple alone, informed that the god Jupiter desired union with them, and that Caligula, as Jupiter's earthly incarnation, would perform the divine will. Refusal was sacrilege, punishable by death or exile. So they went, and their husbands could do nothing. Because how do you protest when the emperor claims to be executing the will of the gods themselves? Ancient sources record at least a dozen specific cases. There were likely many more that went unrecorded, and Caligula didn't hide this. He discussed it openly at subsequent banquets, compared experiences, made crude public commentary about the women involved. The humiliation was part of the pleasure, not merely the act itself, but the complete destruction of dignity for Rome's most powerful families. But perhaps nothing illustrates the systematic nature of Caligula's violations more than what became known as the Imperial Tavern. Caligula converted sections of the palace into what was essentially a brothel, staffed not by professional courtesans, but by women from noble families. He decorated the rooms lavishly, then invited select friends, military officers, and occasionally foreign dignitaries. Fees were charged. The money went to the imperial treasury. Caligula ran it like a business, selecting who would be present each night, setting the prices, occasionally participating himself. Suetonius records that matrons and freeborn youths from respectable families were compelled to be available in this establishment. Imperial officials would circulate through the forum, actively recruiting, or more accurately, compelling clients. Wealthy men were essentially forced to participate. Refusal implied disloyalty. If they couldn't pay, Caligula would generously offer loans at interest, transforming perversion into financial extortion. The debts were recorded in official ledgers. This wasn't hidden vice. This was bureaucratized transgression, complete with accounting. Then there were the contests. Occasionally, Caligula would organize private competitions within the palace, but these weren't athletic games or rhetorical debates. These were endurance tests of physical degradation. He would force participants, often slaves, but sometimes free citizens who had fallen into debt, to perform until they collapsed from exhaustion. Audiences watched, bets were placed, winners received prizes. Losers were mocked, sometimes beaten, some died. The exact nature of these contests was censored or lost to history, but references survive across multiple sources. Cassius Dio mentions shameful contests organized within the palace. Suetonius refers to special nighttime spectacles involving performances of every type of depravity. Seneca, writing after Caligula's death, alludes to entertainments that shocked even the most jaded observers. The pattern is clear, even when the details are obscured. Caligula created an environment where human dignity was systematically destroyed for his amusement, and he had the power to compel Rome's elite to witness and even participate. Now we come to someone whose story reveals another dimension of Caligula's transgression: Marcus Lepidus. Lepidus was Caligula's brother-in-law, married to his beloved sister, Drusilla. He was handsome, charismatic, ambitious, and according to persistent rumors throughout Rome, maintained an extraordinarily close relationship with the emperor himself. This closeness was known at court, ignored publicly, tolerated as long as Lepidus remained loyal. But Lepidus made a catastrophic mistake. He conspired. In 39 AD, he joined a plot to seize power, a conspiracy that also involved two of Caligula's sisters, Agrippina and Livilla. The plot was discovered. Lepidus was arrested. Before his execution, Caligula reportedly interrogated him personally, forcing him to confess details of their relationship in excruciating detail. Then he had Lepidus executed and his sisters exiled. But the cruelty didn't end with death. Caligula sent Lepidus's ashes to Agrippina in an urn and forced her to carry them personally through the streets of Rome to the ship that would take her into exile. The psychological torture extended beyond the grave, designed to destroy not just the traitor, but the survivor's capacity for dignity. Which brings us to the final act, the night before the assassination. January 23, 41 AD. Caligula knows there are plots brewing. He knows the Praetorian Guard is restless. He knows the Senate despises him, yet he acts as though he's invincible. That evening, there's a theatrical performance in the palace. Caligula forces several senators to perform in humiliating roles, some dressed ridiculously, others placed in degrading scenarios. The audience laughs nervously. No one dares not to laugh. After the performance, Caligula selects two senators' wives, young women, recently married, and announces they will accompany him. The husbands watch in silence. One of the women weeps. Caligula finds this amusing. He takes them away. It was the last time he would exercise this particular cruelty, because less than 24 hours later, Cassius Chaerea, a tribune of the Praetorian Guard, whom Caligula had consistently humiliated with crude jokes about his masculinity, attacked him in an underground corridor of the palace. The conspiracy was swift and decisive. The assassins didn't stop with Caligula. They stormed the imperial apartments, found Caesonia and little Julia Drusilla, and killed them both. The child was reportedly thrown against a wall. The conspirators wanted no heir of Caligula's bloodline to survive, no possibility of continuation. They wanted to erase him completely. But here's the question historians have debated for 2,000 years. How much of this is actually true? Suetonius wrote his biography of Caligula decades after his death. Cassius Dio wrote almost 2 centuries later. Both relied on earlier sources, some contemporary, but both also had agendas. Suetonius wanted to entertain. Sensational stories sold. Dio wanted to moralize. Terrible emperors made current ones look better by comparison. Both wrote under later emperors who benefited from Caligula being portrayed as a monster. Modern historians point out that some stories are almost certainly exaggerated. The famous tale about making his horse a consul appears nowhere in contemporary sources, only in Suetonius decades later. Likely a misunderstanding of a sarcastic comment Caligula made about useless senators, but other stories have multiple independent sources. The relationship with Drusilla is mentioned by Suetonius, Dio Tacitus, and Josephus. The behavior with senators' wives appears in multiple texts. The palace establishment is referenced by 3 different authors. The pattern is too consistent across too many hostile witnesses to be entirely fabricated. The truth is probably somewhere in the terrible middle. Caligula didn't do everything attributed to him, but he did enough to earn his reputation. He was 24 when he took power, with no experience governing, given absolute authority with no checks, no oversight, no way to say no, and he had tendencies that power amplified catastrophically. Remarkably, the first 6 months of his reign were reasonable. He freed political prisoners, reduced taxes, hosted games, distributed money. He was popular. Then he fell seriously ill, severe fever. In October 37 AD, he nearly died. And when he recovered, according to every source, he was a different person. Paranoid, cruel, delusional about his own divinity. The behaviors that would culminate in assassination less than 4 years later began after that illness. Medical historians have speculated about brain damage from encephalitis or meningitis. Psychological historians suggest the brush with mortality broke something in his mind, confronting death at 25, when your emperor of Rome, might shatter a psyche. He emerged apparently convinced of his own godhood and determined to prove he existed beyond all human law. And so Caligula becomes a case study in what happens when power has no limits. The Roman Republic had checks, consuls balanced each other. The Senate held authority, tribunes could veto. But Augustus centralized power, Tiberius consolidated it. And when Caligula inherited it, there were no real limits left. Only convention, only tradition. And Caligula ignored both completely. His successors learned partially. Claudius, who followed, was cautious, maintained the appearance of respecting the Senate. Nero started well, but eventually repeated some of Caligula's excesses, because power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The phrase is a cliché, but Caligula is its definitive proof. His victims weren't statistics. They were real people, real women forced into impossible situations where resistance meant death, real families destroyed, humiliated, erased, real children who died because they carried a tyrant's blood, all because one man had power and no conscience to limit its use. The monster wasn't obvious at first. He was young, charismatic, initially popular. He used the language of divinity. He claimed to be fulfilling a higher purpose. But when the mask dropped, the damage was already done, and without systems to stop him, He continued until someone with enough courage acted. Cassius Chaerea paid with his life shortly after executed by Claudius's supporters for killing an emperor. Even a hated one, but he freed Rome temporarily until the next tyrant rose. The palace corridor where Caligula died still exists. Buried under centuries of construction, part of the archaeological layers beneath Rome's streets, sometimes workers uncover fragments, tiles, a bit of fresco, coins dropped and never retrieved, and occasionally, late at night, when restoration crews work in the silent ruins, they report a strange feeling in certain passages, an inexplicable heaviness, as if the stones themselves remember, as if some echoes never quite fade. The blood was scrubbed away 2,000 years ago. The names were chiseled from monuments. The Senate ordered his memory officially damned. But the lesson remains, carved not in marble but in the dark corners of human possibility, that when power has no limits, when one person can bend reality itself to their will, the results aren't divine, they're monstrous, and the boundary between civilization and nightmare is far thinner than we'd like to believe.